Hello, everyone. Thank you so much again for joining us for a bonus webinar as part of the California Fire Science Seminar Series. This seminar will conclude the series for this season, but we will be back soon. If you'd like to stay updated with the announcement of the continuation of the series, please sign up for the seminar series newsletter, which you can find on the California Fire Science Consortium website, namely cafirescience.org. The link will also be shared in the chat box, so please keep an eye out for that. My name is Ajinkya Desai, and I am currently a PhD candidate at UC Irvine working on Wildland fire atmosphere interactions in Professor Tirtha Banerjee's group. I am also a member of the student committee who assisted in planning this webinar series, and I'll be your host for today. The California Fire Science Seminar Series is organized and supported by the Berkeley Fire Research Group, College of Engineering, University of California at Berkeley, the University of California, Merced, and the California Fire Science Consortium. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'll just go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the California Fire Science Consortium website and YouTube channel. All registered participants will be emailed a link to this recording once it's available, which is typically within a week. This email will also include a brief evaluation survey, which we hope that you will complete because it helps guide the development of these webinars in the future. And now to introduce our speaker for today, we are very grateful to have Dr. Mark Finney as our guest speaker for today. Dr. Finney is a senior scientist and research forester with the U.S. Forest Service, Rocky Mountain Research Station, Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory. Excuse me. He obtained his PhD in Wildland Fire Science from the University of California at Berkeley in the year 1991 and has dedicated his career spanning multiple decades to the understanding of fire as an ecological and physical process. His modeling endeavors have formed the basis for several operational wildfire predictions throughout the US, and you may also find his work featured in several journals such as Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, also known as PNAS, International Journal of Wildland Fire, and Forest Ecology and Management, just to name a few. Today, Dr. Finney will delve into the intricacies of developing a physics-based wildfire behavior model. Following Dr. Finney's presentation, there will be a Q&A session, and please feel free to add any questions that you have to the Q&A chat throughout the presentation. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Finney.
Thank you, Ajinka. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me to this seminar series. Look forward to talking with you about work that's been ongoing here for about 20 years, maybe more than that. So without further ado, let's see if I can move my slides. Many of you probably haven't been to the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory, so I thought I would just give a quick introduction to it. We have several different fire research projects here: fire behavior, fire and ecosystems, smoke and emissions, as well as developing fire management systems. The laboratory has been here since 1960. It has a large burn chamber where we do experiments where we don't control the wind, but can control humidity and temperature. And then we have a wind tunnel, 3 by 3 meter wind tunnel, where obviously we control wind up to about 8 miles an hour and do a lot of experiments in there. We also have a new burn facility. We call it the grain bin or the pyro silo, and it allows us to burn very large woody fuels. I won't talk about any of that work today, just no time. But large woody material and deep depth layers is a completely separate subject than flame spread modeling. So why is the fire lab in Missoula? Well, it started in 1910. You may be familiar with the 1910 fires or have heard of them. The 1910 fires burned about 3 million acres on the Idaho-Montana divide, killed about 85 people, and really caused a change in the way the Forest Service and the nation thought about managing our forests, and really introduced fire suppression as a main function of the agency. But it also started a program in fire research beginning shortly after there with Harry Gisborne as the first full-time fire researcher in the agency. So this is Priest River, Idaho, very close to where Missoula here in the Northern Rockies. But then there was the Man Gulch fire in 1949, a tragedy where 13 firefighters were killed. And as a result of that, some political pressure was put on the agency to build fire labs. And they built one in Macon, Georgia in 1958, built ours here in 1960. This is the last one left. So let me give you a brief modeling history how we get into fire behavior. Initially, and right after the 1910 fires, the research was more about fire danger, people trying to understand how to understand the various factors that were contributing to large fires and fire business on the landscape, such as when we should stop slash burning, when campfires were permissible, how to staff firefighting resources, that kind of thing. So fire danger these are relative indices correlated with spread, ignition, and suppression difficulty over large areas. They're not specific. These indices are not specific to specific fire behaviors that are quantitative metrics like the times, the distances, the rates of spread related to fire and its environment. Initially, the fire danger rating work established that fuel moisture was a very important factor in whether fires would start and whether they would spread. Here's just an example from 1928, looking at duff moisture content and its relation to these qualitative categories of is it generally safe to do burning all the way to extremely dangerous kind of fire conditions. So very general kinds of work in fire behavior or in fire danger. But fire behavior questions weren't far behind. And not much after that, 1930s and 40s, work was begun trying to understand how to use the same quantitative information to predict actually how fires would spread, how fast they would spread, how big the perimeter would be so that you can contain it. This is an example of some work that was done in California by Wally Fons, where they actually had a wind tunnel out in the woods where they burned things. And so that was before any of the fire labs were created, and they used little frames to look at fire spread in different directions. And this is where it began to be clear that the properties of the fuels were very important to how fire spread. So coarser particles versus finer particles and the packing of them in the bed all changed the fire spread rate. They started looking at the growth of fires in 2 dimensions, looking at these oblong or these elliptical kinds of fire shapes. Not much was really done in terms of fire modeling until the 1970s in terms of practical outcomes. This the instigation for this came from efforts to characterize fire spread as a steady process, a balance of the heat being generated by the fire with that amount required for ignition. So this is a paper that has one of these kind of formulations in it from Bill Franzen in 1971. And what you see here is rate of spread equals this propagating flux, which is watts per square meter or joules per square meter per second, divided by the net heat absorbed per unit fuel bed volume at ignition, so joules per cubic meter. And if you divide the units out, you end up getting meters per second, so a rate of spread. There's a number of problems with this kind of a formulation, one of them being that the amount of heat for ignition is not a property of the fuel bed per se. It's a property, associated with individual particles. So it's impossible to really calculate the quantity. It really is associated with a flux rather than just a total quantity to raise a volume of the fuel bed or particles to ignition. We'll see that here in a little bit. But this formulation was used by Dick Rothermel, published in 1972 with his well-known spread equation. It's pretty much formulated the same, but he notes here that the heat flux terms are unknown. We do not know what the mechanisms of heat transfer are, radiation and convection, and how to characterize those. So this equation really is agnostic with respect to how fires actually spread. It's a quasi-physical formulation, but it is a very empirical solution to the entire thing. But Frank Albini took this equation, and by 1976 had produced a fire behavior prediction system out of it. Because there were no computers that were widely available to people, this was released in a nomogram form. Nomograms basically consist of a number of panels that are linked, and you work your way through on the axes of these different panels, and you end up in a different panel, eventually predicting the spread rate and the intensity of the fires. But it was also put on computer punch cards, and it was very useful in those early days for research purposes. But for practical purposes, it was all done by nomograms. And the way people took these calculations and applied them to fires in the field was by getting out a topographic map and estimating the fuel types associated with it, making calculations, drawing arrows on the map, assuming a certain stationarity in time, and then plotting the fire perimeter growth over time. So very crude, but nevertheless, it was a quantitative way of estimating the fire growth in complex conditions. Now, that all changed as computers became faster and more readily available, as well as GIS data and GIS systems. And we began producing spatial data to help in these kinds of calculations, where the computer actually did all the simulation work and the fire propagation. It just needed input data. So these are some CDs. Even before the days of DVDs, these were CDs that were just built by individual national forests to run fire models for fire growth prediction. And today, we now use these same suite of models, as well as all the data sets that were conjured up in the 1960s and the 1970s. We use those in a plethora of different fire behavior prediction systems. And there are so many that this is what one part of the challenge in producing a new replacement fire behavior model, that we have so many systems that rely on these models, that if you come up with a new model, it better be good and it better be easy, because it's got to be substituted for all the modeling processes in all of these different programs. And here's just an example of the kind of demand that we place on the current modeling systems. This is a Monte Carlo risk simulation for the continental United States, done at 270 meters. Tens of thousands of years of simulated weather go into this kind of thing. But the point is that to get a map like this of the probability of fire impact required 94 million fires to be simulated. What that means is there's probably hundreds of billions of actual fire calculations that went into this. So if we're going to replace the Rotherham spread equation and all of that in order to maintain our capability in this kind of modeling system, we're going to we have some challenges, right? A lot of practical challenges to do that. So the reason that we use all these, the Rotherham spread equation and all of these other data sets associated with it, is because they're operational, they're practical, and they're functional. But they do have major limitations, and that's what this major part of this talk is about, is to talk about how do we go about replacing this system? How do we develop a physically based model to replace the current empirical models? And the problem with empirical models, purely empirical models, is that you can't extend them. So if you come up with new conditions, you're changing the fuel properties, for example, with management. You have different kinds of weather extremes that you want to be able to model. You can't just change the individual components of an empirical model. You need new data that supposedly would fit with the original data set. The current models are steady state, just in the heading fire direction. That means there's no thresholds for when the fire will spread or not. If you're familiar with the spread equation, you know that it has a moisture of extinction, but that's not something that the model tells you. That's something that you tell it. You have to tell it by fuel type, what are the moisture conditions where the fire won't spread. So if a model was any good, it should tell you when it's not going to spread. But this Rotherham spread equation always spreads unless you tell it not to. So there's lots of other limitations here. Another major one is the homogeneous nature of the fuels assumed. So it pretty much takes all the fuel properties and smears them out evenly across the terrain, and there's no gaps and there's no heterogeneity in it whatsoever. So that really limits the applicability to much more realistic scenarios, such as sagebrush or bunch grasses or pinyon juniper, or in fact, all of our fuel types, they have a lot of spatial heterogeneity in it, right? And another is the constant weather and winds. We can't deal with gustiness, for example, or switching wind directions like that. All right, so the challenges of advancing a new wildfire model into this kind of system, this practical system that we've got, um, is that one, if we come up with a physical model that we think is good, we basically assume responsibility for explaining the physics of fire spread. So it's not just a model, it's just not our interpretation of the physics. It actually has to be defensible and offer an explanation for how fires behave, something that we currently can't do. The Rothermel spread equation, which forms the basis of most of our training uh, uh, curricula, it does not explain how fires behave and how it spreads. And so the curricula are they're formed around the model, right? Not on the way that fires actually behave. Another problem here is that we don't exactly understand how all the physical processes are combined. It's a dynamical system, as we'll talk about, and there's still a lot of work to be done to understand some of the basic physics. We have to have computational efficiency for any of these programs to be operational, right? The Rothermel spread equation is very fast. That's how we can run it billions and billions of times. Well, it's not going to do as much good to replace a fast running model with a much slower running model if we hope to have wide use of it. The other factor here is that we need to have a model that's robust to uncertainty, because in practical environments, we don't know everything all the time. We don't know where the fire is sometimes. We certainly don't have a good description of the fuel properties at fine scales, and we don't know what the weather is all the time. So the fire modeling has to be robust to a lot of this unknowability of the environment. And the last challenge here is that whatever model we develop, we need to make it usable by fire personnel, because they're not graduate students in engineering or in physics. That is not their discipline. They're professional fire managers, and so everything has to be designed around that kind of client. So this is a quote from a paper in 2003 that kind of summarizes what I've just talked about. This is a paper from Terry Clark and others. It says the science of wildfires is still in its infancy, and the physics of how they spread is still poorly understood. Numerical models are a necessary step towards wildfire prediction, but they face an enormous task of treating a physical problem where the relevant spatial scales span 6 to 7 orders of magnitude. That's a massive issue. If your physics is always operating at the fine scale, but you're trying to make predictions at very coarse scales in space and time, then you have a serious computational challenge, and you can't feed it with all the fine scale fuel information at those very broad scales. So our objectives here are to develop a high resolution model. Basically, we want to represent the physical processes as best that we can. We do not want to compromise on that, because that's the scale at which people see fire. That's the scale at which it actually operates, and it's the scale at which you can compare a model to your data. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to validate model predictions, the physical processes model against the observations. We need a simple formulation, the simplest possible, without being too simplistic. It has to be very fast running, has to be able to deal with non-uniform fuel, weather, and topography. And we want it for broad uses, very much like the Rothermel spread equation is used now. We need whatever we replace it with to similarly have the ability to be used in, say, 2- and 3-dimensional simulations for large fires. So this is kind of the way our reasoning went, is that we need to have very fast computing time. So at the low end of the y-axis here. But the problem is, as we try to model and capture the fire physics in higher dimensions, in 2 and 3 dimensions, we run into problems of computational performance. So the three-dimensional models, for example, are very, very slow unless you decrease the resolution, you coarsen the resolution. But what happens when you start to coarsen the resolution to increase your model performance, you also decrease your physical fidelity. You start to get away from the physical processes that can be measured and can be known at the scales at which they operate, and you have to have substitutes or parameterizations of those. And so what we decided to do is to try to aim over on the right-hand side, in the lower right-hand side of this graph. We want very fast computing time, very low computing time, but we want high physical fidelity. And so our formulation is a one-dimensional model. So a 1D chain of cells where we're going to simulate spread across that one-dimensional array. And so we have a vegetation complex here, some trees or grass or shrubs or any kind of fuel. This is being very generic. And we have a 1D linear array of cells. So it's a one-dimensional array. It has dimensions of depth and width, obviously, but these are not, they don't involve any physics. We don't have cells that are three dimensions. It's a one-dimensional cell, but they have characteristics that you describe for their depth and for their width. So that's the easy part, is designing the model construction or the formulation. The hard part is putting in the physics into any kind of a system, including this one. And one of the challenges here is that fire spread is a coupled nonlinear system. You have an ignition, which ignites some fuel that begins to burn. In a combustion process, it releases heat. Some of that heat is transferred to adjacent fuel particles that ignite. And if they ignite, they begin to burn and release heat, and the entire system cycles, just like that diagram. And so there's not really a beginning and an end once ignition takes place. If any of those processes fail to produce an ignition, then the entire system comes to a halt and you don't have fire spread anymore. So this is what makes it very difficult to apply steady state solutions to a system that is nonlinear and it's coupled, meaning that the fire is heavily involved in the entire system. It's not just an independent calculation of what the fuels or the topography or the weather contributes. It involves the fire as well. And so let's talk quickly about ignition and how do we know how fuels ignite. So in our Wildland situation, we have a fairly unique kind of fuel. It's based on vegetation, either living or dead, and often both. And this vegetation is necessarily finely structured. So we tend to have fuel particles that are a millimeter or a few millimeters across in diameter. That's very different than a lot of other fire environments, whether it's in buildings or whether it's in industry. We have solid fuels that are fairly fine. They're discrete, means they're separated by air. And this sounds very simple, but it's an important characteristic of our wildland fuels, because it really changes the way they respond to their environment, their heating or their cooling, when a fire approaches. And so Jack Cohen, a colleague of mine, and I worked on this for a number of years, published a few papers on this. I'll go through briefly a few of the findings here that are relevant to the formulation of the fire model. One of which is the distinction between fine fuels and how they respond to radiant and convective heat versus coarser fuels. So here we have an example of fine particles, 1 millimeter shredded wood compared to with a block of wood 13 millimeters across. And which one do you think is going to ignite first if we expose it to a radiant heat source with a flux of 37 kilowatts per square meter? Well, if you think that the fine fuel will ignite first, you'll be exactly wrong. The fine fuel heats just like the coarse particle heats, and you can see on this set of axes here, over time, the temperature starts to rise. And initially, the blue line there is the fine fuel particle, the 1 millimeter particle, and the 12 millimeter particles in red. Initially, both both particles begin to increase in temperature when they're exposed to this radiant flux. But look what happens to the fine particle. It reaches a temperature of, say, 160 degrees, 180 degrees, and then it just kind of bounces around for a while. It doesn't continue to increase in temperature. It just stays approximately the same. Now, the 12 millimeter particle increases in temperature up to about 350 or so, and then it ignites. And it gets hotter and hotter because of the combustion going on the surface. So that's very counterintuitive to most people, that it is easier with radiation to ignite a large particle than a fine particle, because most of us have experience lighting things with convection. We put a match to the fine material, and that would light a lot easier than that block of wood. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about radiation versus convection. And this is the same for many different kinds of fuels, not just these artificial shreds of wood. This is grass sitting in front of 41 kilowatts per square meter. And it's just sitting there, and it would sit there without smoking, without decomposing for a very, very long time, days. So next, the question is, what if we take fine fuels, the same 1 millimeter particles, and we change their packing, right? We change the way they're arranged inside of a clump. Well, on the left-hand side is a compressed a ball of this shredded wood, this excelsior, and on the right, it's a very loosely packed. And if we expose this to only 30 kilowatts per square meter in this case, we watch what happens. You can see immediately on the left-hand side that you're starting to get smoking and pyrolysis going on with the ball of the tightly packed ball, but you don't get anything going on with the loosely packed wad. And that loose material there is convectively cooling. It's bathed in cold air, and so it's cooling as fast as it heats. And this is the principle that these papers I talked about deal with, is that the fine material has a difficult time heating only from radiation in our fires as they approach them. And they may heat up, but they are too cool for pyrolysis and for ignition. And therefore, convection plays a very, very substantial role in our wildfire spread. So we studied fuel particle ignition in spreading fires to understand how this happens. And for our spreading fires, we use a lot of artificial fuel, the kinds of fuel particles that can be readily controlled. We can control exactly the particle and the fuel bed packing very precisely. This is made out of cardboard. It's a laser cut cardboard, so we design whatever kind of particle sizes and density we'd like on the computer, and then just print them out. We can arrange them however we want. And when we build beds like this and we run fires through them, we have an excellent opportunity to study fire behavior under much more controlled conditions than we could with any other kind of fuel. What this study that I was talking about did is instrument a fine particle and a coarse particle within these spreading fires, and you can see them on the right-hand side. And the fire, that as it sweeps over this particle and comes closer to it, begins to produce a very intermittent signal of bathing by the flame. So it's receiving radiation. Radiation is increasing as the fire approaches, but the flames, as they're lapping forward in the fuel bed, are not a constant source of heat. It's very, very intermittent. And so, as you'd expect, the small particle, in fact, both particles, respond very, very well to the changes in the flame bathing and whether they're bathed in flame or not. So on the x-axis here is time, and as the fire is approaching, the y-axis is the irradiance, and that is the heat flux received on the surface or near the surface of the particle. And you can see that the red line is going up with time, right? It's going up to a maximum of about 30 kilowatts per square meter, very similar to those heating panels that we were looking at. And the blue line there is the gas temperature. That is the bare air thermocouple sitting there recording whether or not it's in flame or not. And the signal that you're seeing there is this very jumpy intermittent signal where once the flames are there, it jumps up a few hundred degrees and then back down, and then another in another cycle. And so very, very pulsating kind of flame contact. And if you zoom up on the last 20 seconds of this particle's life, what you see in the black line there is the particle surface temperature. That the particle surface temperature in black goes up only when it's bathed in flame, only when it's coincident with a spike in the blue line. And then it declines in between these flame pulses and rises again when it's bathed in flame and then decreases. This is happening all the while that the radiation is going up. And so clearly this demonstrates in a spreading fire that the radiation is insufficient to heat these particles to ignition, that it requires kind of this intermittent stair-step type heating associated with fluctuations in flame contact. So the way that we have to deal with this, what this means is that we have to be able to reflect how individual particles respond to their changing environment. So what we've done is included a 1D conduction model, particle-based, in these cells, paired that up along with an ignition temperature. So when the temperature of the surface reaches this threshold, then ignition is said to take place. So the way it looks in our little schematic here is each of these cells has particles in it. Each of these particles is a certain size, has material properties like density and conductivity, etc. We can have different particles, mixed size classes of fuels in there. And each one of these particles, or a representative particle for each one in each cell, is modeled in terms of how the temperature profile inside the particle changes when the boundary conditions change. So this is really important because these fuels, even our 1 millimeter thick fuels, cannot be considered thermally thin. They're thermally thick fuels, meaning that there's temperature gradients inside it. The only way to really deal with that is to have a one-dimensional or even a higher dimensional model, let's say, to represent the temperature gradients and how that particle responds to changing surface flux. So we set an ignition temperature, and when these particles reach that, then it's said to ignite and they begin burning. So let's talk about another part of the model, and that is the combustion part. This can be a very, very complicated part. In fact, all of this stuff can. And we investigated for a very long time how to deal with combustion and the burning rate and the energy release rate of fuels for this model. And we defaulted to something that's been used quite often, but you've done a lot of experiments to better characterize it, and that is the residence time. So the flaming residence time, since this model is primarily aimed at the moment at the flame spread, just the flaming portion of the front of the fire, we're going to represent the burning rate of it through use of a residence time. And so that is how long the particle will flame in a given setting. So this is applied to arbitrary fuel complexes based on primarily fine fuels up to about 6 millimeters in size, and mixed sizes of those. Large fuels, we hope someday to be able to add that, but that is not part of it at the moment. So one thing we realized with a lot of experiments is that the residence time, flame residence time, how long a flaming combustion takes place at a given point in the fuel bed, that's largely independent of the size of the fuel beds that we burn. We burn some very large ones, 2.5 meters wide, some medium-sized ones, about 0.5 meter wide, 0.6 of a meter wide, and some very small ones, only 0.2 of a meter wide. And what was amazing for a given particle size and configuration, that the residence times were nearly identical. Very, very insensitive to the size of the bed. Can't completely figure out why that is, but it is demonstrated in our data. And so we've done a whole series of tests. I'll let this play over and over again, where we take particles of different sizes, we pack them in different conditions, different moisture contents, different densities, different packing ratios. And what you're seeing here are two different beds. The one on the top has a packing ratio of 0.048. That is 0.048 fraction of the volume of the fuel bed is filled with fuel. And so the one on the bottom, it's 3 times that, about 3 times that. And what's interesting about this is these are the same fuel particle sizes. They're just packed in different densities. And so you can see that the top one spreads a lot faster, but the residence time is about 15 seconds. Residence time on the bottom one is 45 seconds. And so even for the same particle size, packing it in denser means it burns slower. Pretty interesting. And if you do this for a lot of different fuel beds, a lot of different materials, different sizes, different moisture contents, densities, all of this, you find out that you can do a very good job of predicting with this empirical equation. The residence time is a function of the packing ratio, the loading of the fuel bed, the surface area to volume ratio of the individual particles, and the moisture content. So packing ratio and fuel loading increase the residence time, surface area to volume ratio decreases the residence time, and moisture content increases the residence time. So if we know the amount of fuel in the bed, which we do, and we know the flame residence time, and we know the fuel mass consumed in flaming, with its heat content, we can calculate the energy release rate and duration. So now we have fuel being consumed at a certain rate in combustion. We need to know how the heat is transferred to adjacent fuel particles. So we have models for radiation from the flames and from the fuel bed solids that are burning. And we have a model for the convection based on the mean gas temperature profile and velocity. So I'm going to talk very briefly here about the convection, because that's actually a fairly new component to this whole body of work. Radiation has been modeled for many years, and the model that we're using here was actually developed by others. So I won't spend much time talking about radiation, but mostly on the convection portion. But so the heat transfer by radiation convection can be divided into three components. The convection basically is flames sweeping forward, intermittently lapping into the fuel bed ahead, and we have radiation from overhead flames impinging on the fuel particles, and we have fuel bed radiation coming from the solid material radiating and glowing inside the bed. Now, all of these depend on flame length. We have to know what are the flame dimensions that come off of burning a certain fuel at a certain rate. So one of the techniques that we've come up with to characterize convective heating and flame length is called a sand burner. And what a sand burner does, it doesn't burn sand, but it uses sand as a diffuser. We have propane gas that's issued from underneath the body of sand, and this gas comes up and it is burned on the surface in a very, very uniform way, kind of a substitute, a proxy for a spreading fire, but this time it's stationary, so we can take lots of measurements. And we can control the gas flow and intensity separately from the flame zone depth. So this is very important. Flame zone dimensions, the geometry can be controlled independently of the intensity. You can't do that in a spreading fire. And so the construction, we have several of these sand burners here. You can see pouring sand in on top of these tubes and putting partitions in between the gas tubes, and then screeding out. This is a small burner, but screeding out the sand so that it's flush with the decking. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different papers right here. The first one is on flame length, and the second one is on how the convective heating changes upstream or downstream, from a flame zone. So this is a paper that we published a few years ago, and it deals with this correlation of flame length with fire line intensity. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see two of the most common correlations that have been proposed. One from Byram in 1959 and one from Thomas in 1963. Now, the differences here are pretty substantial as you start to get increase in fire line intensity. And in fact, if you look at a lot more equations, you find that pretty much that entire space is filled with different proposed correlations. And this is way too messy to use for any modeling that we have. Which equation do you pick? And if you're picking that one, does it introduce lots of artifacts for the other components in the system? The answer is yes. So one one of the things that we found as we were using the sand burner is that the flame length not only depends on intensity, but it also depends on the flame zone depth. That is, how wide the base of the flame is also has an influence on the height of the flames. So you're seeing here the same intensity in our sand burner, but flame zone depth going from 0.15 meter all the way up to over a meter, and you can see that the height of the flames goes down. Well, we did that across a large number of different combinations of intensities and flame zone depths. And here you can see our data in black lines plotted on these same axes, along with Thomas's equation in the red and Byram's equation in the blue. And that is a family of curves that we found, a family of lines corresponding to flame zone depth. So the narrower the flame depth is, the taller the flames for a given intensity. So here's our equation there. Our equation, our correlation, shows that flame length is a function of intensity for sure, but inversely proportional to the depth of the flame zone. So this is the equation that we're using in our model because it much more accurately captures the effects of flame zone geometry on the flame dimensions. So let's talk about the convection part. I've already showed you here, real fire spreading in these laboratory fuels and how the flames are very non-steady. The convective heating is very intermittent as these flames kind of flap forward into the fuels. Well, that's a big challenge to try to capture in any kind of simplified model. Most of the models that try to deal with convection explicitly as a heat transfer mechanism do some sort of fluid dynamics, represent the convection by simulating the fluid dynamics, the fluid motions of the flame in the plume. Well, we're not going to do that because that is going to take a huge amount of effort, huge amount of time, and we're not going to be able to produce a practical model for our objectives. So our model is based on some observations about pool fires that have been made for many, many decades in fire engineering literature, where here you have on the left-hand side, you see a time series of snapshots of flame structure for a circular pool fire. It's burning some alcohol or some gasoline or something like that, and it's very, very non-steady. The flames are pulsing and jumping up and down. And yet you can characterize the temperature profile above those flames using a power law function of vertical distance. And so this has been reported in the literature for many years. The graph on the right shows how the temperature on the y-axis varies as a function of the height above the source. And it divides into three different regions. One is the continuous flame, where the flame is always present, and you end up with a pretty constant temperature there of about 800 degrees, more or less. These are on log-log axes. So then you have a region of intermittent flames where the flame is lapping and moving. And finally, you have the plume. Well, so this power law profile is very, very robust to lots of different pool fire sizes and intensities and all of this. So this was some guidance on what we could possibly do if we measured the temperature next to a flame rather than above it. And so we use our gas burners and we instrument the decking in the downstream direction with a whole series of thermocouples, and we measure at very high rates the temperature fluctuations as a function of distance away from the flame edge. And what we find is relationships that look generally like the previous one, right? You can see that as we vary intensity in the lower left panel there in panel D, we vary intensity, we change the position of this power law decrease in temperature. As we change the slope, we change it. As we change the flame zone depth, the wind speed, and the flame front, the width of the flame front. If we vary any of the characteristics of the fire front geometry or its intensity, we're changing this gas temperature profile. And with a little bit of statistical modeling of those results, we are able to come up with a predictive characterization for the mean temperature at a given distance from the front. So these two graphs are from the model. The one on the left is plotted on log-log axes. The one on the right is in linear axes. And so it's the same information, just plotted a different way. Up to now, I've showed you all this on log-log axes, but the curves in linear space look different. But this is just an example. So we have 4 different slopes, 0, 10, 20, and 30 degrees, and 2 different intensities. And you can see that the temperature decline with distance is a function of both of those terms. It's a function of half a dozen different characteristics of the flame front. This is what makes convective, characterizing convection so darn difficult, is because it's a function of all the characteristics of the fire and the environment. So with this characterization of the gas temperature, you can see that knowing the distance any fuel particles are away from the edge of the fire, we can calculate what, and of course the energy release characteristics of the fire, its intensity and flame length, etc. We can calculate what is the mean gas temperature at that distance. So that affects the boundary conditions on the fuel particle as it's responding to the radiation and the wind speed and all the other factors. So one thing I'm not going to talk too much about, but this technique seems to be generalizable to a 2-dimensional case. If we build a sand burner like we've done here that rotates relative to the wind and the slope, then what we can do is measure the change in temperature along the decking as a function of the angle as well. And therefore, even with a 1-dimensional model, we can calculate 2-dimensional characteristics of the heat transfer. So if you know the orientation of the fire front, then you can calculate the temperature profile, the gas temperature profile, as a function of that orientation, as well as the other fire characteristics. All right, so what I've surveyed here are a number of different experiments associated with the three principal factors that determine fire spread as a coupled nonlinear system: combustion and heat transfer, igniting fuel particles, and then feeding back into the combustion. What I'd like to do is demonstrate for you a version of the model. See if I can. Let me stop sharing this. I will share the screen again. Okay. So I'm assuming that you're seeing this. If you're not seeing a window that has some graphs, some lines in it, let me know. This is a version of our new fire model. This is not meant for anybody's usage at the moment, but a version like this could be used as a standalone application. In here, there's a number of different settings. I'm not going to bother going through all of them, but we can set weather characteristics. So we can have a steady wind speed. We can have a sinusoidal wind or a synthetic wind stream. Let's just start with steady wind speed. Let's go with 4 meters a second. What the heck? 3 meters a second, it doesn't really matter. We can change the wind speed relative to the orientation of the fire front. So this is using the gas burner information that I just showed you, where we rotate the burner relative to wind and slope. We can change material properties. In this case, we have straw that you can have wood, cardboard, any materials where you specify the density, specific heat, conductivity, and heat of combustion. I'm not going to change any of that for now. Then you can formulate those materials into particles. Because this is a particle-based model, we need to have particles of a given size and different properties. So here we're using straw, 2 millimeters. I've created a particle here, 8% moisture content, but you can make any kind of particles out of any kind of materials that you like. Then, so the next the next step is to construct a fuel bed of these particles. So here's a hierarchy, right? You have these material properties, you have particle properties made in the materials, then you have fuel beds made out of all these particles. And so right now we're not able to ingest any kind of real fuel information from an inventory, but you can easily envision how you could if you had fuel characteristics as they changed in along a one-dimensional transect. That could be easily included here. But let's just make a artificial bed at the moment. Okay, we're going to stick with 0-degree slope for the beginning. We're going to have an ignition depth. What is that? Well, if you go out and light a wildland fire, you know that how much fire you put down on the ground matters to whether or not the ignition is successful. If you under fairly marginal conditions, if it's fairly moist or the fuels are not very continuous, just lighting a match into this fuel complex may not result in a spreading fire. And so you'll have to light more. And so this is the depth. This is the distance inward towards the fuel bed that you're lighting all at once to generate an initial ignition. So we'll just go with 1 meter so that we make sure it spreads, but I can show you how dependent the simulation is on the ignition configuration. So fuel bed width, we'll go 50 meters, but it is sensitive to this. We'll play with that in a second. The length of the bed, 100 meters, number of cells. So this is discretizing the entire thing. Here's our straw, 8% moisture content, 2 millimeter particles, loading of 0.3 kilograms per square meter. Doesn't really matter what you put in here, but just leave it at this for now. Fuel depth of 0.3 meters. So this would be like a medium tall grass, not very dense, not very dense. So when we add fuel to the fuel bed, it basically shows a profile here. It's continuous. I can do fuel particle monitoring. We can basically instrument a fuel particle just like we have in our experiments, and we can compare those experiments to this. So let's run this whole thing, and what we get out of here is a single run. So this is just a single run. You saw it run there in 4 seconds or something. The green line is the spread rate as it increases over time. You can see it starts off at very near 0, and then it increases, and then it levels out, becomes steady. The black line here, the black line is increasing, is the position along the bed. Okay, and then we have flame length and we have flame zone depth. And we can plot this in terms, not just time, but also in terms of fire position. Okay. Another output from this is the heating characteristics on the particle. So we can look at the gas temperature adjacent to it, the radiant surface flux, the convective surface flux, and the surface temperature of the particle as it goes up to ignition. This can be plotted in terms of time and fire position as well. So then we also have in here a little animation, which is kind of fun to watch. And the way this is just an animation, but here's our flame structure on the top, and that's fuel consumption and temperature field on the bottom. And so you can see that the flame length increases as the fire spreads, and then it spreads as pretty much steady rate as it moves across. All right, let's shake this up a little bit. Let's instead of having a fuel bed with uniform fuel, let's have all the same things, but now let's put a 1 meter gap in it. So we have 2 meters of fuel and 1 meter of gap. And so this is something that we can't do with the optimal spread equation. We can't have a look at this. Let's do our fuel particle monitoring. But you can see how fast this goes. The particle does not exist. Look at that. That's because I'm specifying a position on the bed, and it happened to fall in one of the gaps. Okay, here we go. So you can see that now, because we have gaps in there, we have not just smooth curves of heating. We have this kind of oscillating thing where the fire hangs up on one side of the gap, spends a little time there, and then the heat flux decreases to the surface of the particle, and before it actually is able to cross. So let's see what our animation looks like here. This is kind of fun. It starts to get more interesting. So now our little flame is jumping around up on top, right? You can see that it's seesawing because it burns out the fuel within the clump, and then the heat is still being transferred on the other side of the gap, and eventually is sufficient for ignition, and then we get spread. So one thing I can do here is let's find out the limits, the fuel bed limits here to spread. So let's see 1.3 meters. I'll add that, and I do not know what's going to happen, but we'll find out. Oh, it's going to spread. Okay, so you can see the average spread rate here is jumping around. Let's look at the animation. Play at the same speed. Okay, now it's even in a wilder swing because it's barely crossing these gaps, all right, before it goes out in the clump. So this can go on and on. Think of all the different factors in wildland fire that can be changed and affected, to look at how it spreads. And it's really hard to do with a simpler model with the Rothman spread equation. So I'm going to do 1.5 meters in the gap. Okay, remove the fuels. Okay, so now it's just a little bit bigger and it doesn't spread. Okay, so I can play games here. I can say, okay, what about a 6 meter per second wind? Oh, now we're going to get a spread. So what I'm doing here is showing you that the results of the simulation show how complex the interaction is of all these different factors. It depends on the fire, depends on the fuel, depends on the weather. There's all these things that are very, very difficult to simply describe because it's this coupled nonlinear system. So I'm going to stop that right there. I want to do one other demonstration for you, just to show you. And this is something that you can play with yourself, not this version. Okay, I'm going to share the screen window. One second. Chrome tab. There we go. Share. Okay. So I'll supply the link for you for this when we're done. But this is a version of the model that I just showed you. But this was produced in cooperation with Google Research, who ran our one-dimensional model more than 600 million times in order to train a machine learned model on the behaviors of the 1D simulation. And so what this is a nice little demo here. It lets us play with all of these factors, yet not have to simulate it. And so this is a graph on the x-axis here showing mean wind speed and then spread rate on the y-axis, okay? But we can change a bunch of things here. So let's go with discontinuous fuels. And let's increase the fuel gap size. Whoops, now none of it spread, right? Okay, so look at the shape of these curves. So as the spread rate changes as a function of wind speed, what you're seeing here is certainly the response to the wind, but then there's a threshold. You see how there's each one of these curves at different moisture contents drops off and goes to zero spread, where everything on the left-hand side of that curve means that it will not spread. So these are the thresholds in spread that are defined by fuel gaps and different winds, in different moisture contents, the different fuel bed width. So if I increase the width of the fuel bed to 100 meters, nearly 100 meters, it probably should give us a little better response to this. A little better, not too bad. We'll click back on continuous fuels. Okay, and then so notice that the maximum rate of spread here is up in the 140, 160 meters per minute range at 100 meters wide. But let's go down to 7 meters. So this is a much narrower fuel bed, narrower fire. Most of the wind is going around it. And now the maximum is up there around 60 or 70 um, meters per minute. So the width of the bed matters a lot. Actually, all of the factors matter. But I would encourage you folks to go off and um, explore this little application here. Um, Let me know what you think. It's kind of fun. But one of the, I'm not going to finish. I just had two more slides. But in conclusion, here, basically, there's two different versions of this model that we have now. One of which is the actual simulation, which takes on the order of seconds or tens of seconds to run each case. What we also want to produce is a machine learned version of that, so that that can be embedded in lots of different applications. It's exceedingly efficient processing wise. You can do a million calculations in 50 milliseconds with the machine learned version. And so it basically has no computational overhead and does a pretty good job of representing some of the characteristics of the 1D model. So anyway, I'd be happy to answer a few questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Finney, for that presentation. We'd like to open it up for Q&A. Due to time constraints and high attendance, we ask that all questions be submitted through the Q&A chat. If we are unable to get to all questions, we will forward additional questions to Dr. Finney and send the answers in a follow-up email. So diving right into it, our first question is, have you looked at the effect of fuel geometry on the spread rate?
Field geometry, you mean the particle geometry, I'm assuming, like whether it's circular in cross section versus square or flat. We haven't looked too much at that. Most of the experiments we've been dealing with are involving very small fuel particles. They're the laser cut cardboard or medium density fiberboard and other kinds of things. We haven't really messed around with the aspect ratio of the cross section. So whether it's a, very elongated rectangle or something.
Got it. Thanks. The next question is, we know that wildfires in mountain regions with downslope windstorms may create vertical transport, either ascending or descending, depending on where you are relative to the mountain wave. So two questions stemming from that. Have you done any experiment that could evaluate these impacts? And could you potentially add these effects of downslope windstorms into your 1D model?
So, the phenomenon that in question here has really to do with the three-dimensional, four-dimensional aspect of fire, right? We're talking about mountain waves, we're talking about atmospheric effects. And where the 1D model could be valuable here is if it was embedded in a higher dimensional model. So if we have a three-dimensional code, very much like some of the mesoscale models that are currently have a fire component to it, if the 1D model was in there, then it would offer a more physical representation of the fire part of that, and it would be up to the larger code to be able to handle the hydrodynamics and the interactions with the energy release of the fire.
Thank you. Your demo so far shows how fire moves through one fuel stratum. How do you incorporate fuel and its discontinuities over various strata that is along the Z-plane?
Yeah, in the vertical. Now, that's a
Yeah.
good question. We haven't extended this model to the vertical, although we do have, I think, all of the necessary information to calculate convective and radiative heating in the vertical direction. We just haven't approached it yet. But one way we could do that is to have a second or third line of one-dimensional arrays, at some vertical distance. But that's an excellent question. It's certainly something we've thought about, but just haven't done it yet.
Do you see some version of the current fuel models being usable in this model?
No,
Okay.
No, the current fuel models uh, have average loadings by size class, right, and then a nominal depth associated with them. That really, if you want to, of course, you could um, have a similarly homogeneous kind of a description that would go into this bed. But really, the value is that um, we would be able to, with a new model, deal with the heterogeneity that you just can't with current fuel models. So I would hope, and we have also been working on other projects with other partners to be able to come up with a different way to describe fuels that does include explicitly the heterogeneity in all of our fuels, right? Because a lot of the complexity in fire behavior we see in the real world is because of heterogeneity we're not able to capture by our current modeling. So it would be kind of a waste, in my view, to have a next generation physical model fed with uh, you know the original kind of
Mm.
um, very general continuous fuels.
Got it. I think this probably piggybacks on your question about embedding the 1D model within models of higher dimensions. There's a question over here that asks, how do you envision including a 1D model such as this in a 3D weather-linked model? For instance, connecting this 1D model to the spread rate of a 2D fire perimeter.
Yeah. So all I've shown you, well, yeah, I didn't really have time to show a two-dimensional version of this, um, but that is what we're doing now. And because we have the heat transfer in two dimensions, depending on the orientation of the flame front, um, and so it is possible to, in a couple of different ways, imagine using a 1D model embedded within these two or 3D approaches. And and one way, the more complicated way, is to do independent heat transfer and spread rate calculations at a given angle, at a given orientation of the flame front, right? And that way, one would not have to make all the assumptions associated with an elliptical fire, right? That's an empirical fit to observations. But another way, the simplest way, the easiest, fastest route to do this embedding would be to just take the flame spread characteristics, the frontal characteristics that we have in the model, right, and rely on the same elliptical dimensions that are a function of wind speed and slope that we currently do. So there's a couple different options here. Ultimately, what we'd like to do is get away from the elliptical assumptions because that's been extremely difficult to verify and it doesn't really have a physical basis yet, if at all.
Okay, and I guess the final question for today, how is your model being received by fire management personnel working in the field?
Well, it's not because it's not been released.
Mm.
So we don't know yet. One of the challenges that we have, I mentioned it earlier, is um, as we strive for an improved physical characterization of fire behavior, we have to do a better job of training and educating the people who will be using such a model. And so this is a chicken and egg problem, like many of them. It's a coupled system. It's a theme here that you can't really make the best use out of more sophisticated tools until you have more sophisticated users. But how do you have more sophisticated users until you have the tools? And so I don't really know the answer to how all of this is going to be transitioned into practice. That's going to take a lot more work than we can do here just at the fire lab. That's going to take a entire agency effort to start not just developing the tools, but also developing a curriculum that can have users that appreciate how to do that. Because there's a lot more to fire spread and fire behavior than the way we've been teaching it for 5 decades, and that has to change.
Perfect. As we wrap up today's session, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us and give a special thank you to Dr. Mark Finney for his time and effort in sharing his work with us. Before we sign off, I'd like to remind everyone to please keep an eye out for the webinar evaluation that will be emailed out this week. And with that, thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in our future sessions. Have a great day.
Have a good one.